warm welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sophie Limbin. I'm the editorial partner for the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. At the Women's Forum, we believe that women's voices and vision are crucial to building a more inclusive economy and society. In collaboration with the New York Times, we are delighted to host a series of live conversations with women leaders. Women from around the world, women on the front lines, women leading us through the crisis. Today, we'll hear from one of these leaders, and I expect that you will leave this conversation inspired that the current crisis can result in a positive and meaningful change, whether for humanity or for the planet. This will require intention and action, something that today's speakers knows quite a lot about. A quick note on audience questions. We'll be taking as many as we can through the live chat on the right of your screen. So please submit them. And also, you can follow the conversation on social media with the hashtag #WomenForInclusion and in her words. And now, I'm very pleased to introduce Matina Stevis-Gridneff, Brussels correspondent for the New York Times. Matina will lead our conversation today with our fantastic guest. Matina, please, over to you.
Thank you, Sophie, and thanks so much for inviting me to moderate this conversation. It's amazing to see that we can still do these very meaningful things in this virtual age and probably actually make them more inclusive. It's a real honor and pleasure to welcome today to this forum Rachel Kyte. She's the Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a former Special Representative of the United Nations for Sustainable Energy for All. And I think the reason why Rachel's participation today is just so incredibly timely and prescient is that around the world, here in the European Union, in Brussels, where I'm sitting, as well as across other parts of the world, the developing world, the United States, the big conversation running alongside the healthcare challenge the world is facing is that of the economic recovery. Until 5 minutes before COVID began being the new reality and the new normal, we were talking so much about the way to switch to the green economy. Here in Brussels, this was top of the agenda. It was certainly a policy component that was becoming very, very prominent in terms of economic development in Europe, and indeed a matter for debate around the world. But it has felt that perhaps COVID has put a stop to this momentum, which was very real until just so recently. And I think Rachel's just the perfect person to discuss why this agenda not only shouldn't go to the back of the line, but has the real potential to be integrated in whatever economic recovery lies ahead. I'd love to invite Rachel just to give us some of her top thoughts on this subject, and then hopefully we'll have a chance for a couple of questions before we turn over to the audience. Rachel?
Hi, thank you, Martina. Thank you, Sophie. It's lovely to be here today. Yeah, so this is a dislocation unlike anything that we've sort of experienced in recent times. And in a moment of dislocation, we have an opportunity to sort of obviously deal with the immediate crisis, which is obviously a health crisis. It's a respiratory crisis. I mean, if you have already a compromised health system, then you are more vulnerable to this disease. And so when we think about how to build back, we have to think about how to get businesses back, how to get people back in jobs, how to get food systems, energy systems moving again. But there is a moment for learning, right? So our energy demand has completely collapsed as we've all had to stay at home. So energy demand is down worldwide by, depending on where you are in the world, by 20 to 30 percentage points. That gives us an opportunity to really think about what is the energy system that we need as we come back. Why is the energy system so important? Because the energy system accounts for the largest amount of carbon emissions, which was driving the economy closer and closer to a precipice when it came to our ability to manage climate change. So if you think about the COVID crisis, we were warned that there was a very significant risk of a zoonotic pandemic. Right? We have warned that we are at risk of extraordinary economic impacts, extraordinary human impacts from climate change. And so as a society, we've got to be able to respond to what we call the grey rhinos, these big risks that are sitting right in front of us that we tend to try to ignore. And so if we are already in a climate crisis and we've got a very few short years and decades to sort this out, the way the economy comes back needs to be resilient to that crisis as well. So how do we use recovery and stimulus money to spur more and more renewable energy? We already know that the oil and gas and fossil fuel part of the energy economy has been in real trouble, that for geopolitical reasons, and then with the collapse of demand, oil prices came all the way down. Before the crisis, investors have been walking away from oil as an investment, and the oil companies' stocks have been performing really badly. I mean, the value of oil and gas on the S&P 500 is less than 5% before this crisis. So already the world was saying, okay, we need to decarbonize, therefore we need to invest in what is going to be competitive in the decarbonized world. And that is renewable energy. It's a clean way to produce steel. It's a low carbon way to produce cement. It's the hydrogen economy for shipping and aviation. So what I think people are discussing is using public money to stimulate that. Now, the good news is that most of those green things, those clean things, are actually job rich and job rich in local economies. So happy to get into some of the details of that, but that's what's up for grabs. Now, in the EU, they're saying that the Green New Deal will be part of the recovery, so they don't see that the green and recovery are in opposition. Lots of jobs and refurbishment of energy efficient buildings, etc. You're also, everybody's watching China to see how China reacts and recovers from this crisis, while at the same time needing a 14th five-year plan, which puts them on a cleaner road forward. And of course, here in the US, in an election year, climate's not an election issue, but the long-term recovery of the economy needs to leave the US competitive for clean energy, competitive for sustainable food and agriculture, etc.
One of the things that have been quite troubling for the switch to a sort of green economy agenda pre-COVID was getting on board some of the countries, like Poland, for example, that are on the fringe of that movement, are not convinced, and also have very cheap, accessible, carbon-heavy energy sources at their disposal. And those were the countries in the run-up to the European Union presenting its new Green Deal, as they're calling it, who were negotiating for longer periods to comply with new targets, who were asking for higher subsidies, et cetera. And while I really hear your argument that there's just so much public funding on the table right now, some of these countries, and indeed countries closer to both the core of Europe, for example, as well as big advocates for the green economy, will also be concerned that the costs of these transitions to more green infrastructure for the economy, this is not the right time to bear that cost or to impose that cost to potential labor displacement or technological refurbishing. That this is the time to just rev up the economic engines. If that means relying on antiquated, old, or harmful for the environment infrastructure, then so be it. Anything to get the economy restarted. Let's worry about those transitions later. What do you say to that?
Well, so I think that restarting or pouring public money into a zombie company, or a company that's going to become a zombie company within a few years, because carbon intensity is going to be something that you don't want to hold. If you're certainly that's where private investors are going. And so why would public investors want to hold on to carbon assets? Then you're just creating sort of bad assets on the public balance sheet while the private sector is going to be investing in clean. I don't think that works for the poor and the vulnerable either, who depend upon public support. So I think that there's a question of, like, is that really a smart move, and wouldn't it be better to learn the lessons of reconstruction? I mean, Europe has in the 80s built a European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in order to manage the transition and the adjustment from as the Iron Curtain collapsed. And that was about taking very, very big, uncompetitive industries that were dirty, that had huge payrolls, and turning them into things that could be competitive in the global world. So I think we know a lot about how to structurally adjust. We know a lot about how to do that. In the 1990s, the banking crisis in Sweden showed that you could separate out good assets from bad assets, and you could manage them in a sustainable way. And so I think that there's a lot of lessons learned about how to do this. The worst thing in the world would be to double down on what's not working, what was already unattractive, and which was already not performing very well. I think there's one other thing, which is I think that public attitudes around health and the environment are holding up, and probably made even stronger as a result of this crisis. And so, I don't think that investing in things which are going to make the air really dangerous for us again is something that's going to hold a lot of truck for very long, especially with young people. And then as for Poland, we already saw the one big coal-fire investment project that was on the books cancelled, I think, this week, because the investors were already not showing any real appetite for that. And even in Poland, and especially after they held the climate talks there in 2017, there's the beginning of a shift in attitude. Might not be represented quite yet in the parliament, but definitely as you travel around Poland has great wind energy. It has other resources. It has a coal-fired resource associated with one part of the country and with one part of the politics. That's not insurmountable in the long run.
Certainly. I wanted to ask then, and also considering what we heard more recently earlier this week from German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Macron about the recovery in Europe, we did hear a strong green message from them, and that's something that's underpinned the discussion in Europe. Obstacles and pockets notwithstanding. When you look around the world for political resistance or just grassroots level resistance to this type of rebuilding, where do you see the bigger fault lines? Where do you see the biggest work people like you need to do to get that message across to governments and even to communities as well as business leaders?
So I think there's been one very interesting thing about this pandemic crisis, is that it really has shown that populists, whether they come from the left or the right, so whether we're talking about Nicaragua or Mexico or Brazil or the United States, don't do well with scientific advice. And so there's a correlation really between leaders who aren't particularly keen on taking political advice, good scientific advice, and their response to this crisis and the way in which they're managing it competently. And therefore, you think about, well, what's going to be their response to the next crisis, which is also where you need science to advise you, which is the climate crisis. I think at the grassroots around the world, people see with their own eyes. They see crops disappearing, they see crop patterns changing, they see the air quality diminishing in their cities and towns, they see the sea level rising, they see the impact of storms. So people know the climate is changing, and that what they want is, government to work with them to build resilience. And what they're looking for is, so if I'm going to change the way that I behave, I'm going to eat differently, I'm going to use different modes of transport, or I want to be able to access, an electric vehicle or whatever. They want the government to be a partner in that, and then government has to sort out the systemic issues and where the carbon is really intensive in the system. And it's been very interesting to watch energy demand come down and to watch emissions not come down quite as much. And I think it really sends a very powerful message that it is about all of our individual action, but it's actually about the power generating system. It's about heavy industry. It's about land use and deforestation. These systemic causes of emissions really need to be grappled with, and for that you really need government working in combination with the private sector. But I think public attitudes around the world is, I want to be resilient. I want my government to help me be resilient. I want the government to focus on resilience. It'll be interesting to see the impact of this crisis on those public attitudes going forward.
Just one thing, talking a little bit more about coordination and bringing it more to a global level. One thing we've definitely seen in this crisis, and it's really been quite eye-opening, has been a sort of pause in multilateralism globally, which was already, frankly, not having a great time. Forums for coordination of policy, including, again, the European Union, which is as close and as coordinated as these fora get, struggling to keep all members and all participants on board. And as different countries were hit in a different way by the pandemic, worse or less badly, different countries pursued diverging policies. How do you get those climate outcomes that were already, not there was no common ground around the world for them in the first place, in an era of particularly historically weakened multilateralism, and with the United States and China, two superpowers, if you will, just so deeply engaged with what's happening at home and unwilling seemingly to play that role in global leadership? How do you make that action, even among countries that are on the same page and in agreement on how to proceed? How do you make that matter? How do you get those climate related goals that were being set earlier when pretty much it looks like every man for themselves out there right now?
The Secretary General, before this crisis, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who himself had been a prime minister, so I think he can speak to these things, always used to bemoan in the struggle for climate ambition and action what he called insipid political leadership. And sort of, it's insipid with a capital I when you think about how slow off the mark the G20, the G7, even the UN Security Council, and then sort of other forms of international cooperation. At the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, they were able to agree a sort of debt relief package for the poorest countries, but it didn't go far enough, fast enough. And we've still got a huge issue now of the kind of sovereign indebtedness that a number of these countries will find themselves in if they get the access to the packages that the IMF is sort of pushing out of the door every day. So we've got major structural issues. I think about it in two ways. I think that we have to sort of put scaffolding around the current fora of international cooperation, whether that's the WHO on the search for a vaccine and how to make that affordable equally to everybody, and to the management of the pandemic, or whether it's the IMF and what does the IMF do when the vast majority of its members are asking for financial help? How do we have that work? Or whether it's the UN or whether it's the WTO, which is also suffering from a particular sort of downturn in its strength at the moment. We can't solve these problems alone. You can't isolate yourself from a pandemic, and you can't isolate yourself from climate change. So we do have to find mechanisms. In 2008, I worked in the international financial system at that point, and in the standing up of the G20 in response to the financial crisis, you had committed multilateralists sitting in key jobs in international organizations and in key jobs in key governments. And there's no getting away from the fact that when you've got inward-looking politicians in key countries of the global economy, it makes it more difficult. China is now no longer sort of at the kids' table. It's now at the main table, sitting in one of the chairs of honor. And so, the dynamics are different now than they were in 2008. But I am really struck by some of the leaders of smaller countries, for the way in which they talk to the population about crisis and crisis management, and the way that they talk about the need to cooperate in the world. So, there is something that we call reciprocal vulnerability. And I think women leaders are frankly better at it. And it's basically where you stand up and say, you know what, I don't know, we don't know, but we are going to get through this together. There's something extraordinarily powerful in that. And if you look at the countries that have done that versus the countries where it's like, we're best at this or we're best at that, whether or not that's really true, I think that for the kind of crises that we've got to manage, for the kind of international cooperation, walking into the room saying, we don't know, but we're going to get through this together is not a bad place to start.
Right. I have loads of more questions, but I'll try and bring in some questions from our audience. I see here, and obviously given our forum, I think it's particularly pertinent. There's a couple of questions, both from Lawrence Presses at BNP Paribas, as well as Mil Neilpold, who's the CEO of Mara Partners. Both these members of our audience are wondering how we can make this work more for women in the context of a green recovery. Laurence at BNP Paribas is asking, how can we foster women-led green startups and companies in this context? And Mil from Mara Partners asks, given how many issues faced by women are exacerbated by climate change, and recognizing the power of women to provide solutions to climate change, can you describe your ideas to promote women's leadership on climate? And just to make both those questions a bit more targeted to our current conundrum, how can you maintain that? How do you propose that we can maintain that priority in the context of the COVID recovery?
Okay, so we could do a lecture series on that. Those are such good questions. Let me take one slice of the economy and try to answer it in that respect. I could answer it for energy, but let me answer it for food a little bit. In the developing world, 80% of the farmers are women. Women's access to the ability to borrow for their businesses is still not what it should be. I think a lot of legal barriers have been taken away, but it is not the practice to understand the particular dynamic of women-owned businesses or women's own access to land and to chattels when they're farming, and their ability to get collateralized support. So there's everything we know about supporting women-owned businesses at micro, small, and medium-sized level is important for a dynamic economy. Even more dynamic when you're trying to build back from a kind of a crisis like this. But we've also seen extraordinary disruption to food supply chains around the world. You saw a financial crisis hit the developing world, magnified by the economic crisis as capital was repatriated, and then you saw the COVID now beginning to take its grip on Africa, and of course they've got a locust crisis as well in East Africa. So you see these compound crises coming in, and we have to be able to find ways to keep people farming and to learn a lot about why those supply chains became so broken so quickly, and why we were so unable to pivot to fix the problem. We had the opposite. We have a similar problem in the developed world, where you see incredible aerial shots of 9-mile long queues of cars for a food bank in Texas and Pennsylvania and all over the country. So in that, I think that there is a recalibration of global and local in food supply, and I think there is, I think going to be a real need to focus on the fact that one of the leading elements of resilience is going to be your ability to access an affordable, healthy diet that is good for the planet. At the moment, the food system's killing us and it's killing the planet. So this has all been revealed in this crisis. So rather than having lots of supply solutions about global food supply chains where you buy your bread from a company the other side of the earth, is there a way to build resilience, deal with the fact that people aren't eating healthily, deal with the fact that our food systems are not good for the planet? Is that beyond us as an international community? Is that beyond us nationally? Is that beyond us locally? I'm very lucky. I can walk down the hill and buy eggs from my local farm. And so if I go to my supermarket and I queue to get in, there's no eggs. But if I walk down the hill to the farm, I can, if I'm lucky, get myself a dozen eggs. It's going to make people think differently. I'm not anti-globalist, but I think that there's much to be done. And at the heart of all of that are women, because women are principally the majority of micro and small enterprise owners worldwide.
Let me press you a bit on that, actually, if that's okay, because I've just relocated to Europe after 5 years in East Africa. And one thing that's for sure is that millions of livelihoods across Africa and parts of Asia, of course, depend on food exports. I rejoice when I find green beans from Kenya in my local organic supermarket here in Brussels, even though I know very well how costly it was to the environment to get those nice Kenyan green beans here. I also, I'm also pleased for the growers who have a global market for their goods. How do you maintain those livelihoods and jobs at the scale that's requisite, especially as parts of Africa are extremely badly hit by the sort of COVID-related recession? If you're going to be digging in those global food supply chain disruptions, how do you do that? There's just not that level of demand locally.
Yes, you're exactly right. And this crisis is going to force us to address some issues that we haven't really wanted to address in the last few years in a meaningful way or in an effective way, which is that, you can grow your green beans in Naivasha and you can export it to the Netherlands or whatever, and I can buy it the next morning. But we don't have access to an affordable diet for millions and millions of Africans. We don't have effective local and regional markets for fresh food in Africa. We have extraordinary amounts of investment needed in cold storage and in supply chains within the region. So we don't have an effective food system, locally, regionally. And so when your shock comes and suddenly there's no flights to Amsterdam anymore, to Schiphol, everything collapses. So what do we learn about the lack of resilience in that food system, which is going to be important for the next crisis, which is the disruption caused by climate change or some other existential threat? The same is true, across Latin America, and most of Latin American countries are exporting their food, and yet Latin Americans are suffering from type 2 diabetes, increasing amounts of non-communicable diseases because of bad diet and health, and we have unparalleled rates of deforestation. So the system is broken, both from the perspective of health and the perspective of the planet, and we've seen that our supply chains really leave us very vulnerable. So that's the conversation. The UN was supposed to be having a food summit, a food systems summit in 2021 that was to sort of look at these questions. And I think that, frankly, we have to use this crisis to make sure that we ask different questions and the right questions because of the vulnerability you describe. So this isn't about, we need to supply more and more food. There isn't enough food in the world. Wrong. It isn't that famine is caused by a lack of food. Wrong. It's the system and the production and the supply chains. And there's something very important that we need to take away from this crisis to be ready for the next one.
Right. I'll bring in a question from the audience again, if that's okay. I have a question from Nina Gardner, Director at Strategy International. She says, when the economy revs up again, will we go back to business as usual? Or will governments and businesses be more mindful of people and planet? How will the response differ region by region? I know that this too is a sort of semi-philosophical, broad question, but I feel like Nina brings up a couple of questions we're asking even on a personal level, going back to business as usual, how to make sure practically that these lessons are not missed. And also, where do you see the real cleavages, geographically speaking, or in other sort of comparative ways that make sense?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's going to be different in different economies around the world. I think we saw some pictures from Beijing or from other cities in China in the last few days of traffic jams because people aren't going onto public transport in quite the same way. And so you've got more cars on the road. So this is really, the recovery for governments. The recovery is going to come in different stages, It's not going to be, there's going to be one package and then another package and another package. And you're starting to see, there was the immediate response to the fact that people was, businesses were just closing down. So how do you keep people with cash in their pocket? How do you keep businesses able to keep people on their payroll? How do you keep essential services open, right? Then the next stage is, as we see that this is going to be a longer crisis and it's going to be a global crisis and it's going to be with us. So what are the next things we need to do? Then you've got this mounting problem of what we do in terms of solidarity with the developing world, who are now beginning to get hit by the virus. So there's going to be waves and waves of response to this. But let me take it back locally to try to answer the question. So here in Massachusetts, they reported that 17,000 jobs have been lost in the renewable energy sector in March and April, which is an extraordinary number. To put it in context, a lot of the political discussion around the energy sector here is that we have to support the jobs in coal and oil. Well, there are 50,000 jobs in the whole of the United States in coal. We lost 17,000 just in Massachusetts on renewable energy. Renewable energy is actually proving to be more resilient than fossil fuel in the crisis, because there will need to be more and more installed renewable energy capacity. So those projects are sort of on hold or going ahead, but they're not being cancelled. But those jobs need to come back. We will need to have more renewable energy. We need to refurbish buildings. And so if you're the governor, or if you're ideally, if you're the national government, if you're the governor or if you're local government, then what are the tax incentives? What are the things you can do in regulation that will support that sector to come back more quickly? And is that where it's worth paying more money, or is that where you want to see tax revenue go? We've been sitting on things which could be extremely important and accelerants to the local economy. We haven't been moving forward in a deliberate way. We've been arguing between local, state, and federal government. So offshore wind, for example, which could create an extraordinary number of jobs onshore in the northeast of the US. So it is in these moments when we're going to have to make a few big, bold bets in order to actually see things come back differently. The bigger question about whether I've changed my food buying patterns in the last 2 months. I'm more like my grandmother now. I'm going and buying a few things, from small suppliers on a daily or weekly basis. I'm not doing a big shop anymore. Is that a permanent shift? I don't know. I think it might be in many parts of the world, or at least something different will happen.
I think we unfortunately need to bring this to a close, but I just wanted to ask one last question that you've kind of hinted to already a couple of times, and we also got through our many questions from our audience. I'm just trying to synthesize a bit here. One of the big issues I'm seeing, again, with my sort of old hat as a former East Africa correspondent, is creating a bigger momentum toward sustainable investments in the machinery that redistributes wealth from the global north to the global south. And that machinery normally is in the form of development agencies run by governments, private investors, as well as the United Nations, the World Bank, and in some cases, the International Monetary Fund system. How do you think this kind of momentum, which had begun for some time now, can gain pace in this recovery, where it's clearly desperately needed, when pretty much the entire developed world is reassessing development funding and its links to the developing world because of budget crunches? I'm already seeing multiple extremely useful programs operating in Africa, serving millions of Africans and giving opportunities, especially to businesses, being suspended because of funding shortage, and pledges are falling behind. Yeah. So how does this keep working?
Well, so first of all, the finance. So first of all, a number of African countries already knew this, but they need to be really in a world where the developed world is in a crisis it hasn't been in for decades and is not paying attention. Right, it's paying attention at home. Then what can happen irregardless of that? So capital flight out of the country, money that is not purposed for development and which is escaping the country needs to be cracked down on. Africans' own savings and investment can be invested in the things that would make a real difference. And the kinds of things that would make a real difference is making sure that your healthcare facilities have access to affordable, clean power, for example. So, these are things that can happen, with or without development aid. Frankly, there's room for domestic investment, and there's plenty of private investment that's going to see the opportunity in that. And I think that will not diminish in quite the same way. I think that development aid is going to be under extreme pressure. And of course, if you're going to go to the international development agencies, it's for budget support because you're having to channel money into your healthcare system and things like that. So there is a big question of indebtedness, and I think there is room for a new Bretton Woods conversation. And my friend Laurence Toubiana, who's no stranger to this forum, called in the South China Morning Post yesterday for a Bretton Woods moment. I agree with her. We need to rethink the international financial system for this crisis and for the next crises. But I think there's lots that African entrepreneurs can do for themselves, and if more African resources were invested in African solutions, that would also help. Doesn't mean to say the international community doesn't have an obligation. It does, but there is a lot that could happen to build resilience within these economies in the coming back. Most African countries spend less than 2% of their GDP on their energy sector, and less than that on the kind of smart grids, utility scale renewables, which are proving themselves to be a good investment and reliable, and even less is going into distributed energy, which is going to be important for rural health clinics and for the farmers that produce the food that we were talking about earlier. So, an unconventional answer, but I think that while we're trying to figure out what to do about development aid, that is not the story of Africa. The story of Africa is African entrepreneurs, many of them women, getting access to African savings and African investment, as well as other international investment, and being able to continue to do what they were already beginning to do quite successfully before this crisis.
Right.
Great. Matina, Rachel, I think we unfortunately going to have to close this great conversation. I just really wanted to thank you for a very inspiring one. Two key messages that maybe I'm taking away, Rachel, from what you said, that this is a moment of learning. Let's not miss it. Let's not miss that opportunity. And I love what you said as well about the power of reciprocal vulnerability. Lots we don't know, but we are definitely in this together. So for those of you who would like to hear more from Rachel, you're in luck, because as part of this conversation, we will be hosting a virtual conference on the May 28th, which is a call to action to the G7. We'll have some of our colleagues from the New York Times moderating some of those discussions as well. Our focus will be on how women's leadership can help to design a better world, looking at access to health, climate action, tech for good, inclusive AI, and women entrepreneurship. So please don't forget to add these upcoming sessions to your agenda. Rachel, we look forward to seeing you on the 28th. Matina, thank you so much for masterful moderation. And audience, thank you so much for being there, for your great questions. And we look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.